The news that their 10-year-old daughter was pregnant sent Mary and Michael's family into absolute turmoil. The identity of the father was a mystery, but on the day of delivery, doctors made an astonishing discovery that left everyone speechless. This shocking incident is one that no one could have expected. Mary and Michael were devoted parents, and their daughter Emma was the light of their lives. At just 10, she was their pride and joy, and together they formed a loving, tight-knit family. They were always out exploring, creating memories, and cherishing every moment together. Michael made it a priority to plan fun weekends, whether that meant seeing the latest movie or spending a day at the fair. Mary ensured that every week had something special in store, valuing family time above all else. Emma thrived in this warm environment. She was a bright, lively girl who charmed everyone around her with her kind spirit. Teachers admired her, her friends adored her, and at home, she was the heartbeat of the family. Her boundless energy and constant chatter brought joy to every corner of their house. That girl could talk till the cows come home. Michael would often joke with a smile as she shared endless stories before finally drifting off to sleep. But as perfect as their happiness seemed, it wasn't built to last. It started as small things, a little discomfort here, a slight stomachache there. "It's probably just something you ate," Mary reassured one evening when Emma complained of feeling sick after dinner. "A bit of rest, and you'll feel good as new by morning." But morning didn't bring relief. In fact, over the following days, things grew worse. Emma, usually so chatty, became unusually quiet, a change that worried her family. By the end of the week, Mary noticed that Emma was clutching her stomach more frequently, grimacing in pain at times. Then, one morning as she helped Emma get dressed, she noticed it, a small, firm bulge on her daughter's abdomen. Mary's heart pounded. "What is this?" she murmured, anxiety rising. Emma simply shrugged, just as puzzled. "Does it hurt?" Mary asked urgently. "How long has it been there?" Emma muttered, looking down. "A few weeks." Mary's mind raced, struggling to make sense of this. It couldn't possibly be what she feared. Maybe it was an infection, a cyst, something harmless. Her voice shaky, she called Michael into the room. His face went pale at the sight. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, grabbing his keys without hesitation. On the way there, Emma sat silently, a rare stillness taking over her normally lively spirit. Mary's hands trembled as she held her daughter's, silently hoping that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. At the hospital, the nurses swiftly took Emma in for tests. As Mary and Michael waited in silence, a heavy sense of dread hung over them. When the doctor finally returned, his face was somber. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," he began, his voice steady but low. Mary's heart dropped, and she gripped Michael's hand tightly. "Your daughter, Ma, she's pregnant." Time seemed to freeze. Mary blinked, struggling to absorb what she'd just heard. The word felt foreign, surreal. Michael's face drained of color, his hand clutching the armrest in shock. "That's impossible," Michael stammered, his voice trembling as he tried to comprehend. "She's only 10. She's just a child." The doctor interjected gently, choosing his words with care. "I know this is difficult to accept, but the tests are conclusive. Emma is already several months along." "No," Mary whispered, shaking her head as her vision blurred with tears. "There must be some mistake. This can't be." Yet the doctor's somber expression didn't waver, as if he'd delivered news like this before. Mary felt her world tilting, the air thickening around her. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her precious, innocent daughter was pregnant. How could this have happened? Who could have done such a thing? Her mind swirled with unanswerable questions. Suddenly, Michael stood, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was twisted with a mix of anger, disbelief, and fear. "Who?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "Who did this to her?" The doctor replied calmly, "We don't know yet. Right now, we need to prioritize Emma's health." "No," Michael's voice rose in defiance. "We need to know who's responsible. Someone hurt my daughter, and I'm going to find out who." Mary, too stunned to speak, felt her world shatter around her. In an instant, the laughter, joy, and dreams of their future vanished. Finally, she managed to whisper, I need to be with her." The doctor nodded, leading her into the room where Emma lay, unaware of the turmoil she had just stirred in her parents' lives. Looking up at her mother, her small face was pale but composed. "Am I going to be okay, Mom?" Mary fought back tears, forcing a reassuring smile. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "We'll get through this. I promise." But deep down, she knew their lives would never be the same again. As days turned into weeks, Mary and Michael grew more restless, feeling trapped in a nightmarish reality that had overtaken their lives. Emma, still so innocent and oblivious, was carrying a child. Once a calm and gentle father, Michael now carried a simmering anger that grew with each passing day. Watching Emma play with her toys, unaware of the upheaval around her, pained him deeply. She was just as she had always been, cheerful and full of stories, untainted by sorrow or shame, her only confusion coming from the strange worry clouding her parents' faces. Michael would stand there, fists clenched, heart breaking with each innocent giggle. Mary, on the other hand, felt hollowed out by grief, replaying moments in her mind, wondering how she hadn't seen the signs, how she had failed to protect Emma from this nightmare. She scrutinized every memory, searching for the moment when something slipped past her vigilance. And at night, as the house lay silent and Michael brooded in the other room, she would silently cry into her pillow, mourning the loss of her little girl's childhood. Yet amid the pain, one thing was certain: they had to uncover the truth. They began their investigation, though it wasn't official. Not yet. Mary and Michael started with the men Emma had interacted with, the people they thought they knew, from neighbors to teachers, even the bus driver, who had always seemed a little too friendly. No one felt trustworthy anymore. Michael created a list of every man Emma might have encountered. He cataloged names, dates, places, the familiar school custodian, the friendly gym teacher who always offered extra help, even the teenage boys who played basketball nearby. No one was above suspicion. Michael considered everyone he thought could be involved, every person who might be responsible for the unthinkable. One evening, Mary sat beside Emma, her voice soft and laced with a desperation she struggled to hide. "Did anyone do anything to you, Emma?" she asked gently, her heart racing. Emma, cross-legged on her bed with a coloring book on her lap, looked up, confusion clear in her young face. "I don't know, Mommy," she replied softly, her brow furrowing as if she were trying to understand a difficult question. "Nobody did anything." Mary's heart sank. The mere thought of anyone harming her child, of someone exploiting her innocence, was unbearable. "Are you absolutely sure, sweetheart?" she pressed, her voice almost breaking. "Did anyone ever touch you or make you feel uncomfortable?" Emma shook her head, looking earnest and sincere. "No, Mommy, nobody did anything. I promise." Mary turned away, biting her lip to stifle her tears. How could this be? How could her daughter, her precious little girl, be so unaware? In the doorway, Michael's face twisted with barely suppressed fury. His patience was waning. It wasn't that he didn't trust Emma. It was that her innocence only deepened the mystery, and he was desperate for answers, no matter how devastating. A few days later, Michael pushed for DNA testing on the baby, convinced it was the only way to reveal the truth. They tested every man on their list: the bus driver, teachers, even some neighbors. The results returned, all negative. Not one of the suspects was a match. Michael was beside himself, pacing the kitchen in anger. "How is this even possible?" he muttered, his voice low but seething. "It's like this was done by a ghost." Mary sat at the table, her hands shaking as she stared down at the test results. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just don't know." The investigation stalled, and days turned into weeks, leaving both parents exhausted and filled with more questions than answers. Then, unexpectedly, a small clue emerged that neither Mary nor Michael could have foreseen. It was a typical afternoon at home. Mary had stepped out for errands, and Michael sat in the living room, buried in a stack of bills, his mind wandering. Emma was nearby, playing quietly on the floor, her dolls arranged neatly in a row. One doll's position over another caught Michael's attention, sparking a vague unease in him. He cleared his throat. "Emma, what are you doing with your dolls?" Without looking up, Emma answered, "They're playing a game." Michael felt his chest tighten, an inexplicable dread creeping in. "What kind of game?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emma, smiling innocently, continued to play. "It's the game I play with Ethan," she replied casually. "The dolls are pretending to be me and Ethan." Michael froze. Ethan was their neighbor's son, also 10. Emma and Ethan had often played together, seemingly innocent games that neither Michael nor Mary had ever questioned. "What do you mean, Emma? What kind of game do you play with Ethan?" he asked, his voice strained, holding back panic. Emma, still smiling with childlike innocence, placed one doll over the other in a way that left Michael in stunned silence. "We play like this," she said matter-of-factly, as if describing any other game. Michael's blood ran cold, the room spinning around him as he realized the implications. This positioning left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a stranger or a predator lurking nearby. It was Ethan, the boy next door. The truth hit Michael like a blow, shattering his world. At that moment, Michael felt himself unravel completely. There was no thought, only an overwhelming rage that surged through him like a storm. Without a second's hesitation, he was up and out of the house, his vision blurring with fury and disbelief. He could barely breathe, his steps carrying him to Ethan's home as if by instinct alone. When he arrived, Michael didn't hesitate. He pounded on the door, each knock echoing louder and more forceful, his fists hitting the wood as though he intended to break it down. David, Ethan's father, finally opened the door, confusion flashing across his face, an expression that quickly turned to alarm as Michael grabbed him by the collar, pinning him against the door frame. "What did your son do to my daughter?" Michael's voice was low, thick with barely contained rage, his face twisted with fury as he tightened his grip, his knuckles turning white. David, taken completely by surprise, stammered in shock. "Michael, what are you talking about?" "What?" David managed to say, but Michael's shout cut him off, his voice filled with venom. "Emma told me. She showed me what they did. Do you think I'll just stand by and let this happen?" He shoved David against the door frame again, harder this time. "Your son is going to answer for this." Hearing the commotion, David's wife, Sarah, rushed to the door, her face pale with fear and confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. But Michael was too blinded by anger to respond, his mind consumed by the image of his daughter, innocent and oblivious, holding her dolls. His control was slipping, and he couldn't stop himself. David's voice shook as he tried to speak, but Michael wasn't listening. The words barely left David's lips before Michael was on him again, each movement charged with an almost primal intensity. "Your son did this to my daughter," he roared, his voice raw and broken, as he pushed David against the door with such force that the sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Sarah, standing in the doorway, looked on, her face stricken with terror. "Michael, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice tinged with panic. Michael couldn't answer. He couldn't find the words. He was too far gone, lost in a torrent of anger and despair. His hands were clenched tightly around David's collar, his knuckles white. In the depths of his mind, he could faintly hear Mary's voice pleading with him to stop, but it sounded distant, muffled beneath his fury. "Michael, please," David stammered, his voice trembling. "This must be a misunderstanding. Ethan, he's just a child. He wouldn't do something like this. He wouldn't even understand." "Don't!" Michael cut him off, his voice cracking as he shook David by the collar. "Don't tell me he didn't know what he was doing. Emma told us, David. She showed us. Your son might be the father of her child." Each word was like fire in his throat, the anger blazing hotter with every syllable. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving. Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in horror. No, that can't be true," she murmured, barely audible. "Ethan, he's just a child like Emma. There's no way. You think we want to believe this?" Michael shot back, bitterness sharp in his voice. "We don't know for sure yet, but your son, he's the only one she mentioned. You'd better hope we're wrong." He let go of David, his fist still trembling with suppressed rage. Before anything else could be said, Mary came rushing down the street, her face flushed with anxiety. She had been out running errands when she received a frantic message from a neighbor who had seen Michael storming toward Ethan's house. As she arrived and saw her husband and David on the brink of a fight, her heart sank. "Stop it," she shouted, stepping between the two men. "Michael, stop!" She placed her hands on her husband's chest, gently pushing him back. "This isn't going to help. We need to calm down." Through gritted teeth, Michael growled, "They want me to believe Ethan didn't know what he was doing?" Sarah looked to Mary, desperation filling her gaze. "Mary, we don't even know if this is true. Ethan, he's just a child. It's hard to believe he could be responsible." Mary took a deep, steadying breath, her voice shaky but resolute. "You're right. We don't know for certain. We're all jumping to conclusions here. But there's one way to find out the truth. We need a DNA test." Both Emma and Ethan. Silence fell. Sarah and David exchanged glances, their faces growing pale. The thought of subjecting Ethan to a test that could reveal the undeniable truth frightened them. But what other option did they have? David finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "Fine, we'll do the test. But if it's negative, Michael, you owe us an apology." Michael didn't respond, his eyes still ablaze with anger. "And if it's positive, David, an apology won't be enough." A few days later, they gathered at the clinic, the air thick with tension as both families sat in silence. Emma and Ethan sat on opposite sides of the room, each seeming lost and unaware of the situation's gravity. Emma looked down at her shoes, nervously fidgeting her fingers, while Ethan clenched his hands in a tight fist, his gaze glued to the floor. When the doctor entered, her expression was solemn as she held the results in hand. She cleared her throat, and the room seemed to freeze. "I've reviewed the tests," she began, her voice steady but serious. "The DNA confirms that Ethan is indeed the father of Emma's baby." Sarah gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she turned to her son, who sat frozen, his face drained of color. David sank in his seat, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the news. Michael clenched his fists, his face a mix of fury and disbelief, while Mary, beside him, pressed a hand to her mouth, trembling. It was no longer just a possibility. It was the undeniable truth. I can't believe it," Sarah whispered, tears streaking down her face. "Ethan, how could this have happened?" David shook his head, his voice breaking. "He's just a boy. He didn't understand. He didn't mean it," he said, though even he could feel the hollowness in his words. Abruptly, Michael stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your son did this to our daughter. Intentional or not, he's still responsible. And so are you." His voice began to rise, and Mary reached over, placing a gentle hand on his arm to calm him. "Michael, please," she said softly. "We need to think about what to do next. We can't change what's happened." Michael's voice was laced with bitterness. Figure out what to do next? They should have been watching their son. Because of their negligence, Emma's life is ruined. David's face flushed as he shot back. "Our son's life is affected too. You're acting as if Ethan's the only one at fault here. It's not as simple as that." He paused, then added bitterly, "If you'd been watching her, maybe things wouldn't have gone this far." Fury flared in Michael's eyes, and he took a step forward, fists clenched tightly again. "If you had raised him better, none of this would have happened. And now look where we are." The room's tension finally erupted. Sarah rose to her feet, her face wet with tears, her voice shaking but filled with defiance. "Do you think we wanted this? Do you think we haven't been questioning ourselves, wondering how this could happen, how we missed it? This is our nightmare too." Both families were now trapped in a storm of accusations and blame, with words being flung like knives, each one cutting deeper into the already fragile bonds between them. The room felt smaller, as if it were closing in under the oppressive weight of anger, fear, and guilt. In the corner, Emma and Ethan sat, caught helplessly in the eye of the storm. Though they were too young to grasp the full gravity of the situation, they could sense the tension, the hostility in the air. Emma hugged her knees to her chest, her wide eyes filled with fear and confusion. She could hear her parents' angry voices, see the pained faces of Ethan's parents, and felt a heavy ache settle in her heart. She didn't understand all of what was happening, but deep down, she knew it was because of her. Did we do something wrong, Dad?" She whispered to Ethan, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't reply right away. His face was pale, and he stared down at his hands in silence, frightened. "I don't know," he mumbled. "I didn't think we did." Emma's heart sank further, a wave of guilt creeping in, wrapping itself around her like a weight. She couldn't escape the feeling that all of this, the yelling, the hurt, the tension, was her fault. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She barely understood what was happening at all. But now, everything felt shattered, and she was at the center of it. "They're fighting because of us," Emma whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "Because of what we did." Ethan stayed silent, but the guilt in his eyes mirrored her own. The two children huddled close, curling inward as if trying to disappear amid the chaos surrounding them. The dreaded day finally arrived, its weight pressing down on the hospital like a dark cloud. Under the bright, sterile lights and the distant hum of beeping machines, Michael and Mary sat in the waiting room, hardly daring to breathe. Their world had shrunk down to this single moment, this one room, as their 10-year-old daughter prepared to give birth. Michael sat slumped forward, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't spoken for hours, not since the doctors had taken Emma away. Beside him, Mary sat twisting the hem of her coat between her fingers, glancing repeatedly at the delivery room door as if hoping it would open and make everything stop. The tension was unbearable, though they still felt anger towards Ethan's family. Even David and Sarah sat pale and silent in their own corner of the waiting room. The rage that had burned so intensely only days before had given way to something far heavier: fear. A fear so deep, so overpowering, that it made the air thick and stifling. They were no longer two warring families. At that moment, they were simply parents, united in their terror of losing their children. Minutes bled into hours. Finally, a doctor emerged from the delivery room, her face serious, her expression calm but grave. She walked toward them slowly, her steps deliberate. "I need to speak with both of you," she said gently. Michael looked up, his face hollow, and Mary's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dread. They stood together, exchanging a glance that held their worst fears. "Is she okay?" Mary asked, her voice breaking. The doctor hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Michael to feel the weight of despair settling onto his shoulders. "Emma is experiencing complications," the doctor said gently. "Her body is very small for this, and her blood pressure is dropping. We're struggling to keep her stable." Michael's knees buckled, and Mary grabbed his arm to steady him as the room seemed to spin around them, the floor falling out from beneath them. "How bad is it?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor took a deep breath. "There's a 50-50 chance, Mr. and Mrs. Mary. We're doing everything we can, but her condition is critical, and time is of the essence." Mary felt her heart shatter, each piece falling into a pit of hopelessness. "She's just a child," she whispered, almost to herself. "She's too young for this. This shouldn't be happening." Michael clenched his fists, desperately seeking something to hold on to steady the storm raging within him. Losing Emma was unthinkable. He couldn't lose his little girl. The doctor gave him a sympathetic nod. "I know this is hard to hear, but we're doing everything we can. We'll keep you updated as soon as we know more." As the doctor turned and walked back into the delivery room, a heavy silence settled over everyone. This time, it wasn't the bitter, tense quiet of two families at odds. It was a shared silence, born of mutual fear. Breaking the stillness, Sarah's trembling voice filled the room. Is this because of us?" she asked, her voice unsteady. She looked to David, searching for answers, but he simply shook his head, his own eyes brimming with tears. Michael, unable to sit still any longer, began pacing, his hands shaking from both anger and helplessness. How had it come to this? His daughter's life was hanging in the balance, all because of a situation that should never have occurred. But the anger he once felt now had nowhere to go. It had dissolved, leaving only sorrow, fear, and confusion. Suddenly, the door to the waiting room swung open, and Ethan appeared, standing in the doorway with terror in his eyes. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, his breaths coming in gasps. He had overheard David and Sarah speaking to the doctors, heard them say that Emma might not make it, that she was in danger. Driven by fear and desperation, he had run down the corridor towards the delivery room, determined to see her, needing to be there. "Ethan!" David's voice called out as he chased after his son, but Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. A nurse near the door tried to intercept him, arms outstretched. "You can't go in there," she said firmly. "It's not safe." But Ethan, small and quick, dodged past her and slipped through the door before she could stop him. He found himself in the bright, harsh lights of the delivery room, surrounded by doctors and machines beeping in urgency. In the center of it all lay Emma, looking so small and still on the bed, her fragile body connected to tubes and monitors, her breath shallow. Ethan's heart ached at the sight of her. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so close to the edge. Tears welled up in his eyes as he rushed to her side, grabbing her hand and clutching it tightly. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the doctors, the nurses, or the chaos around him. It was only him and Emma. "Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know." His words came out choked, raw with emotion. He held her hand tightly, pressing it to his heart as if to anchor her to him, as if he could keep her from slipping away. "Please," he sobbed, "don't go. I need you. We all need you." The doctors were shouting, trying to pull him back, but he wouldn't let go. He held onto Emma's hand, as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded in a world spinning out of control. "Please, Emma, don't leave me." For a brief moment, everything in the room seemed to pause, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The doctors exchanged anxious glances, unsure of what to do. But then, something changed. Emma's hand twitched, a small but noticeable movement. Slowly, her fingers tightened around Ethan's hand, weak but there. The machines beeped more steadily as her heart rate began to rise, and one of the nurses called out, "She's stabilizing." The doctors sprang into action, their movements a blur around Ethan, who refused to release her hand. Her faint grip was enough. It was a glimmer of hope. Outside, both families stood frozen, watching through the small window. When Mary saw her daughter's hand move, she covered her mouth, tears spilling over. Even Michael, still gripped by worry and lingering anger, felt something break inside, a fragile sliver of hope piercing through the darkness. The minutes dragged on like hours, but slowly, Emma's condition began to improve. Her heart rate steadied, her breathing grew stronger, and color returned to her cheeks. The crisis had passed. Eventually, a nurse gently led Ethan from the room, but not before he leaned down and whispered one last promise into Emma's ear. "I'm here. I'll always be here." As the doctors completed their work, both families stood outside, quietly watching the miraculous turn of events. In that room, something far greater than any of them had taken place. Ethan's desperate plea and his unwavering hold on Emma's hand had somehow pulled her back from the brink. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no anger, no bitterness between the families, only a shared, delicate hope that Emma would be okay, and that perhaps they could all begin to heal. And then, piercing through the quiet, a newborn's cry filled the air. The doctor, with a tired but warm smile, wrapped the baby boy in a blanket and handed him to a nurse, who then brought him gently to Emma's parents. For a moment, neither parent spoke. They simply stared at this new life, born under such extraordinary circumstances. It was Michael who moved first, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the baby. Mary watched as her husband cradled their grandson, the tiny face red and wrinkled, oblivious to the turmoil that had marked his arrival. In the corner, Sarah and David looked on, pale but relieved. Mary and Sarah's eyes met, and in that moment, All the hostility that had once separated them seemed to fade. The anger, the blame, all of it dissolved. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and unable to hold back, she approached Mary. She hesitated, unsure if her gesture would be accepted. But then, as if an unspoken understanding passed between them, Mary opened her arms, and the two women embraced. Tears flowed freely, releasing the pain, the confusion, and the fear that had burdened them for so long. "It's time to let go," Mary whispered through her tears. "For them." As Sarah gave a silent nod, her voice choked with emotion. Both women clung to each other in a moment that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Watching his wife embrace Sarah, Michael felt a warmth begin to replace the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. It was as if something soft and accepting was breaking through, bringing a long-sought peace. He looked at David, who stood nearby, also unsure of how to proceed. Taking a steadying breath, Michael glanced down at the newborn in his arms. This is beyond any of us," he murmured, his voice raw from the events of the day. "For Emma, for Ethan, and for this little one, we need to find a way forward." David approached hesitantly, reaching out to touch the tiny hand of the child. "We will," he whispered, his voice almost too soft to hear. Together, these two families, who once seemed irreparably divided, stood side by side, united in the presence of the new life that had entered their world. All the anger, blame, and discord melted away, replaced by a shared sense of awe at the child who had become an unexpected bridge between them. As the initial shock of the day began to settle, conversations gradually turned to practical matters. Emma and Ethan were still children themselves, too young to shoulder the weight of parenthood. Mary spoke up first, her voice steady but laced with the residual intensity of the day. "Emma is still so young. She needs time to grow, to heal. We can't ask her to take on the role of a mother yet." Michael nodded thoughtfully, looking at David and Sarah. "Then, we'll raise him together." He paused, glancing down at the baby before adding, "But we should all choose his name." The room grew quiet as everyone contemplated this first real step toward accepting their shared responsibility. Naming him felt like a promise, a commitment to the child and to each other. Sarah, still beside Mary, offered a soft smile through her tears. "I think we should all have a say in that decision," she suggested. Mary looked back at the baby in Michael's arms, then met Sarah's gaze. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice full of sentiment. "It was my father's name." David and Sarah exchanged a glance and nodded. "Oliver," David repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "A name with strength." With quiet agreement, they accepted the name, feeling its weight like a solemn vow, a commitment that Oliver would be surrounded by love, by family, and by a community united in caring for him. Both families agreed. Ethan and Emma should be able to live their lives as children, unburdened by the responsibilities of parenthood. Mary and Michael would be Oliver's primary caregivers, but David and his family would be there every step of the way, sharing in the love and support that Oliver would need. This new chapter wasn't just about the baby. It was about finding healing for everyone involved. Days turned into weeks, and life found a new rhythm. The once overwhelming weight of resentment and blame gradually gave way to a fragile peace. Mary and Michael's home, previously echoing with their daughter's laughter, now cradled the gentle breaths of a newborn at night. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, they would peek into Oliver's nursery, watching his tiny chest rise and fall as he slept, a reminder of life's resilience and vulnerability. As he grew, Oliver's features began to show a blend of both Emma and Ethan. His tiny fingers would wrap around theirs, and his wide, curious eyes seemed to take in the world, sensing something beyond his understanding. Ethan and Emma, still young and full of life, continued to play as they always had, chasing each other, creating imaginary worlds in the yard. Yet, even in their innocence, they understood something had changed. Oliver connected them in a way that transcended words, bonding them in ways they were too young to fully grasp. David and Sarah's visits, once tinged with discomfort, grew more natural and frequent. They no longer felt obligated to come, Instead, they genuinely wanted to share in Oliver's life and to support Mary and Michael. Small gestures, like bringing toys or helping around the house, gradually built a foundation of trust and care between the two families. The weight of past conflicts still lingered, but it no longer cast a dark shadow over them. Instead, it faded quietly into the background, a softened memory. No one felt the need to rehash old wounds. They didn't need to. The pain was still there, but it had been transformed into an unspoken understanding, a shared experience that had shaped them all. Acceptance had replaced blame, and a quiet resolve took the place of bitterness. They had endured something overwhelming, and together they had emerged stronger. One evening, as both families gathered for dinner in Mary and Michael's home, the warmth of their reunion filled the room with a comforting, almost surreal sense of peace. The gentle hum of conversation mixed with the occasional soft stir from Oliver, who slept peacefully in his crib nearby. The setting sun cast a golden glow across the room, enveloping them all in its warmth. As Mary placed a dish on the table, she couldn't help but smile at Oliver and the family gathered around her. "He's growing so quickly," she said softly, her voice brimming with pride. "He really is," Sarah replied, her gaze resting lovingly on the crib. "It feels like he was just born, and now he's a part of all of us." Across the table, Ethan and Emma laughed together, their chatter brimming with plans for their next adventure, as they momentarily escaped back into the simplicity of childhood. In their innocence, they seemed to reclaim a part of their youth that had felt out of reach. Watching the scene unfold, Michael found himself breathing out a sigh of relief, recognizing just how far they'd come. David lifted his glass slightly, breaking the silence. To Oliver, he said quietly, gratitude filling his voice, "for bringing us together in ways we never could have imagined." Glasses clinked gently, as if not to disturb the serene scene. For a brief moment, silence fell once again, but this time it was filled with a sense of unity, a shared acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them to this point. Mary's eyes met Sarah's, and with tears not of sorrow, but of understanding, she whispered to herself, "We're a family now, no matter what." Sarah reached across the table, gently squeezing Mary's hand. "Yes," she replied, her voice full of quiet certainty. "We are." As the evening drew to a close, the sun set over the hills, casting long shadows across the yard. Ethan and Emma excused themselves to run outside one last time before bed, their laughter echoing in the cool evening air. The adults sat together in silence, listening to the children's joy and watching as Oliver, still asleep, shifted gently in his crib, as though sensing the peace surrounding him. In that quiet moment, Mary glanced at Michael beside her. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. He nodded, wrapping his arm around her, his eyes fixed on Oliver's crib. "Yes, we are." The past hadn't disappeared, and the future was still uncertain. But as they sat together in the warm glow of the evening, both families knew they had found something invaluable, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to love anew. And as Oliver lay sleeping, the once divided families found themselves bound by a connection they had never expected